They say love is blind. Mine wasn't just blind. It was a carefully constructed illusion, and my husband, the man I had loved for 35 years, was the architect. If you've ever had the ground beneath you simply vanish, you know what's coming. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from as my world falls apart. For decades, Richard and I were more than a couple. We were a single entity, the co-founders of the Vance Foundation. It was our life's work, a testament to our shared dream of funding medical miracles. I was the heart, the public face that people trusted. He was the brilliant mind, the strategist working tirelessly behind the scenes. When I was diagnosed with cancer, that bond felt like my only true armor. He became my unwavering rock, managing every detail of our empire so I could focus on healing. I saw his protectiveness not as control, but as the ultimate expression of love. Our legacy, I believed, was indestructible because our partnership was, I was wrong. Our Park Avenue penthouse, once a symbol of our success, had become my gilded cage, a serene sanctuary where I was meant to rest and recover. Every morning, Richard would bring me my tea, review the foundation's agenda with a gentle, hot, reassuring tone, and insist I not worry myself with the details. "Just get well, Eleanor. That's your only job now," he'd say, kissing my forehead. Sophia Clark, my brilliant and ambitious protégée, was a constant presence, a whirlwind of efficiency and what I mistook for loyalty. She would bring me updates from the office, her brow furrowed with a feigned concern that I found deeply touching. She was fiercely protective of my legacy, or so she claimed. Together, they built a fortress of false care around me, a bubble designed to shield me from the world. I saw it as devotion. I now understand it was isolation. They weren't protecting me from the world. They were hiding the world from me, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the plug on everything I had ever built. The sterile, sun-drenched silence of our penthouse was a constant companion these days, a quiet I once found peaceful, but now felt suffocating. I was mentally walking through the steps for my chemotherapy session at Memorial Sloan Kettering, a ritual that had become grimly familiar. My bag was packed. My mind steeled for the chemical onslaught. That's when my phone rang, its cheerful tone a jarring intrusion. It was the clinic. The receptionist's voice was laced with professional apology. "Mrs. Vance, I'm so sorry, but we had to cancel your appointment for this afternoon." I felt a jolt of confusion. "Cancel? I didn't cancel anything." She paused, and I could hear the rustle of papers. "Your husband, Mr. Vance, called this morning. He mentioned a sudden family emergency and assured us he would reschedule personally." A family emergency. My blood ran cold. I thanked her, my voice a hollow echo of its usual strength, and immediately dialed Richard. It went straight to voicemail. A knot of pure, undiluted fear began to tighten in my chest. What emergency? Why wouldn't he have told me first? Hours bled into one another, each unanswered call to Richard ratcheting up my anxiety. I called my sister, my cousins. No one knew of any emergency. The silence from him was a deafening roar in the quiet apartment, desperate for any distraction from the terrifying scenarios my mind was constructing. I picked up my tablet and fell into the mindless, glittering void of Instagram. It was a world away from my reality of illness and uncertainty, a stream of curated perfection, of brunches and sunsets and lives untouched by tragedy. I scrolled numbly, my thumb swiping past images that barely registered, until a familiar face in an acquaintance's story made me stop. It was a short, boastful video clip from the Serenity Suite at the Mandarin Oriental, a place so exclusive it was practically mythical. The camera panned across a table laden with champagne and ridiculously small appetizers, and in the background, a woman was laughing, her head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy. It was Sophia, my brilliant, loyal Sophia, who was supposed to be holding down the fort at the foundation. My breath hitched. The initial shock was seeing her there, looking so carefree while I sat here worrying about a non-existent family crisis. But my eyes were drawn to the champagne flute in front of her. The curved glass acted as a distorted mirror, capturing the opulent room in its reflection. And in that warped reflection, Something glinted, a flicker of gold and leather. A pattern so deeply ingrained in my memory that I would recognize it anywhere. It was the unique, intricate face of the Patek Philippe watch I had given Richard for our 30th anniversary. I watched the video again and again, my heart pounding a frantic, sickening rhythm against my ribs. There was no doubt. The watch on the wrist of the man sitting across from Sophia, the man whose face was just out of frame, was Richard's. The affair wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a brutal, high-definition reality, broadcast from one of the most expensive spas in the city. The ground didn't just vanish beneath me. It opened up into a chasm. The pain of the infidelity was a physical blow, a white-hot agony that seared through my chest. 35 years of love and trust, incinerated by a 10-second video clip. But as the initial wave of grief crested and began to recede, it left behind something colder, sharper and far more terrifying. A question. An affair was one thing, a sordid, predictable human failing. But why cancel my chemotherapy for it? They could have met any other day, any other time. Why choose this specific day, the day of a treatment that was essential for my survival? It was a cruelly unnecessary risk, a layer of malice that made no logical sense. It wasn't just careless. It felt deliberate. A simple tryst didn't require sabotaging my medical care. The icy realization began to dawn that this wasn't just about sex or a midlife crisis. Delaying my treatment served a purpose I couldn't yet see but could feel in my bones was infinitely more sinister than a simple affair. Sitting there, bathed in the afternoon light that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I saw everything with a horrifying new clarity. The fortress of care they had built around me wasn't for my protection. It was for my isolation. Richard's insistence on managing every detail, Sophia's tireless updates, it was all a performance, a meticulously crafted illusion to keep me weak, dependent, and blind. They weren't just cheating on me, they were plotting against me. Canceling my chemotherapy wasn't a byproduct of their affair, it was a central part of their plan. They needed me sick. They needed me foggy and incapacitated from a delayed and mismanaged treatment schedule. The family emergency was a lie to the clinic, but the real emergency was my dawning awareness. The man I had built an empire with, the man I trusted with my life, was not my rock. He was the architect of my destruction, and he was using my own body as his weapon. That night, the click of the key in the lock was a sound I had associated with comfort for 35 years. Tonight, it was the signal of an enemy's arrival. Richard walked in holding a bouquet of my favorite lilies, their funereal white petals a grotesque parody of an apology. He spun a well-rehearsed tale about a sudden crisis with a major donor, his voice oozing with a practiced sincerity that made my skin crawl. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to launch the truth at him like a grenade, to shatter his composure with the words Mandarin Oriental and Patek Philippe. I wanted to see the mask slip, to watch the panic flood his eyes. The urge was a physical force, a tidal wave of rage and grief that threatened to pull me under. But then I looked into his eyes, and I saw it. It wasn't love or even guilt. It was condescension. He was looking at his sick, fragile wife, a problem to be managed, a liability to be handled with gentle lies and meaningless flowers. In that single, horrifying instant, the fire of my rage cooled into a sheet of ice. An emotional confrontation was a trap. It was the exact move he would expect from the frail, chemo-addled woman he believed me to be. Screaming, crying, accusing. It would only validate his narrative, proving I was emotionally compromised and unfit to see through his deception. It would be a fatal error, alerting him and Sophia that their cover was blown. They would simply change tactics, lock me down tighter, and accelerate whatever endgame they had planned. No. A scene would grant them the satisfaction of my pain and the advantage of knowing my hand. The pain of his betrayal was still a raw, open wound, but a new sensation was overriding it. A cold, lucid fury that brought with it an almost supernatural clarity. They had made a critical miscalculation. They had forgotten that the heart of the Vance Foundation was also its brain. I let a tear slide down my cheek, a perfectly calculated performance of sorrow and relief. I made my hand tremble as I reached for the flowers, my touch lingering on his for a fraction of a second too long. "Oh, Richard," I whispered, my voice a carefully constructed tremor. "I was so worried. Thank you." I watched him visibly relax, his shoulders slumping as he accepted my performance as reality. He had bought it. He believed he was still in control. This was my opening, the first move in a game he didn't even know we were playing. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with manufactured innocence and concern. The donor problem. Is there anything I can do? Even from here, I feel so useless just sitting around. I was no longer his wife. I was an actress, and this was the role of a lifetime. I would become the person they saw me as, weak, dependent, and utterly oblivious. My vulnerability was no longer a liability. It was the perfect camouflage. He left the room to take a call, believing he had successfully navigated another minor emotional hurdle. I stood alone in the silence, the cloying scent of the lilies filling the air. I looked at my reflection in the dark window, and the woman staring back was a stranger. The soft, trusting Eleanor Vance was gone, replaced by someone forged in the fires of that afternoon's discovery. This would not be a messy divorce. This would be a demolition, a quiet, methodical, and absolute dismantling of everything they thought they had stolen from me. My objective was no longer just to survive cancer. It was to uncover the full scope of their treachery, to understand not just the what, but the why. Why did they need to delay my treatment? I would follow that question down into the dark, and I would drag their secrets into the light. My penthouse was no longer my sanctuary or my prison. It was now my command center, and the war had just begun. My illness became my armor, and my penthouse, their prison for me, transformed into my war room. The first phase of my counteroffensive wasn't about grand gestures. It was about silence and precision. They expected tears and emotional outbursts. I gave them quiet compliance. They saw a woman broken by sickness and betrayal, resigned to her fate. What they failed to see was the strategist they had long forgotten, the one who had co-founded this empire not just with charisma, but with a mind as sharp as surgical steel. My first call was not to a lawyer, but to an old friend from Vassar, Beatrice, a forensic accountant who had retired after a legendary career dismantling the financial schemes of Wall Street's most arrogant criminals. She was a ghost, a digital phantom who could move through firewalls and ledgers without leaving a trace. My victory wouldn't be won in a courtroom. It would be won in the silent, unforgiving numbers of their own fraudulent books. Beatrice answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp and no-nonsense as I remembered. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. It's Eleanor. I need a ghost. I laid out the parameters. A covert audit of the Vance Foundation's finances for the last 2 years, focusing on any project spearheaded by Richard and Sophia. I would pay her from my personal accounts, routing the funds through a trust that had been dormant for a decade. There could be no paper trail leading back to me. "Consider me invisible," she said, the quiet excitement in her voice telling me she relished the challenge. She didn't ask why. Our friendship was built on a foundation of mutual respect that transcended questions. She knew that if I was calling her out of retirement, the stakes were existential. With Beatrice as my unseen weapon, the financial front of my war was officially open. I had unleashed a predator into their carefully constructed ecosystem of greed. Next, I needed eyes and ears on the inside. My personal assistant, Emily, was a quiet, observant young woman whom I had mentored for years. She was fiercely loyal, not to the Foundation's power structure, but to its mission, and to me. I summoned her to the penthouse under the guise of organizing my personal files. I didn't tell her about the affair or the full extent of Richard's treachery. That would be too great a burden. Instead, I confided in her a carefully curated version of the truth. I told her I had uncovered evidence of a potential external effort to undermine the Foundation, a financial attack that seemed to originate from within. I needed someone I could trust implicitly to help me gather information without raising suspicion. I watched her expression shift from concern to fierce determination. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever you need, I'm with you." I had my operative. The psychological warfare began with a single, perfectly placed drop of poison. During my next scheduled phone call with Richard, after dutifully answering his questions about my symptoms, I shifted the topic with feigned innocence. "Darling, I was speaking with Charles from the board yesterday." I lied smoothly. "He was just raving about Sophia. He said her ambition is exactly what the foundation needs to move into the future. It's wonderful to know she's there, really taking the lead." I let the words hang in the air, a subtle tapestry of praise for her and an implicit critique of him. I was positioning Sophia not as his subordinate, but as his successor. I was leveraging his deepest insecurity, the fear of being overshadowed, the very resentment that had fueled his betrayal in the first place. His reaction was immediate and exactly as I'd predicted. A subtle chill entered his voice. "Sophia is competent, Eleanor, but she executes my vision. Let's be clear about that. She's a good director, but the strategy comes from me," he asserted, a little too forcefully. The hook was set. I had framed Sophia's ambition not as loyalty to him, but as a power in its own right. His ego, so inflated and yet so fragile, couldn't bear the thought that anyone, especially one of our board members, would see her as the new driving force. He was no longer thinking about managing his sick wife. He was thinking about the brilliant protégé who might be getting a little too comfortable in his chair. The seeds of paranoia were sown in the fertile ground of his own narcissism. My next move was to give Emily her first mission. "Emily," I said, my voice intentionally frail during our next video chat, "I've been feeling so disconnected. I was hoping to review some of our past successes. Could you do me a favor and pull the initial budget proposals and all subsequent expense reports for the Genesis initiative? I want the raw files, dear, not the polished summaries Sophia prepares." The Genesis initiative was their flagship joint project, launched just after my diagnosis. It was their baby. To them, my request would seem like the nostalgic whim of a sick woman trying to feel relevant. In reality, I was directing my loyal soldier to retrieve the unadulterated financial records of their primary crime scene, documents they believed were buried under layers of corporate bureaucracy. A few days later, Beatrice called. Her voice was low, charged with the thrill of the hunt. "I have something, Eleanor. It's a pattern of payments from the Genesis Initiative's marketing budget. Multiple wire transfers to a newly incorporated LLC, all for strategic consulting. Each payment is for $9,500. The number was brilliant in its simplicity, just under the $10,000 threshold that would trigger an automatic review by the board's finance committee. It was a classic embezzlement scheme. Death by 1,000 cuts. It wasn't the smoking gun yet, but it was the first thread of the rope they were weaving for themselves. A cold wave of satisfaction washed over me. This was the procedural joy of the hunt, watching the first piece of the puzzle click into place. Now it was time to turn the screws on Sophia. I arranged a 3-way video conference to discuss the upcoming press strategy for the Beacon Gala. From my chaise lounge, I made a show of being weak but engaged. I listened intently as Richard laid out his thoughts. Then I turned my full attention to Sophia. "Sophia, that's a solid framework from Richard, but your instincts on messaging are unparalleled. How would you refine it?" I deferred to her on every key point, praising her fresh perspective and innovative approach. I effectively demoted my husband to a figurehead in his own meeting, positioning Sophia as the true architect of the foundation's public image. I watched Richard's jaw clench on the screen. He was being rendered irrelevant, and I was the one directing the show. The strategy worked faster than I could have hoped. The next morning, Emily sent me a coded text message. She had overheard a raised voice argument between Richard and Sophia outside the main conference room. Richard was furious, accusing Sophia of overstepping and building her own brand on his back. Sophia, never one to back down, had retorted that someone needed to make decisive moves while he was distracted. They were at each other's throats, their partnership of greed beginning to fracture under the pressure of suspicion. They had no idea that I was the invisible agent of their discord, playing their egos against each other from miles away. They were so blinded by their arrogance They couldn't imagine the attack was coming from the one person they had written off completely. Armed with the name of the mysterious LLC from Beatrice, I leveraged a different kind of asset, my social capital. I made a call to a friend at a top private investigation firm, framing my request as due diligence for a potential personal investment. Within 24 hours, I had the corporate registration documents. The company was a ghost, fronted by a professional service, but the name of the registered agent was a minor shock. Marcus Thorne, Sophia's feckless cousin, who I recalled had a penchant for get-rich-quick schemes. The connection was undeniable. This wasn't just Richard's scheme, it was a conspiracy, and Sophia's fingerprints were all over the weapon. The thrill of discovery was a potent antidote to the poison of their betrayal. My next psychological assault was more direct, a carefully aimed missile designed to detonate Richard's confidence. I found an old email from 5 years prior, one in which a major donor had praised Richard's unmatched strategic mind. I forwarded it to him with a simple, devastating note. Found this while archiving, my love. It made me smile. I'm so proud of the leader you were. It's so important to remember those days. The subtext was a dagger. You were great once, but you've lost it. You are a shadow of your former self. I was preying on his greatest fear, that his time at the top was over, that he had become the very thing he resented. Mr. Eleanor Vance, a man defined by his wife's legacy, not his own. The explosion was spectacular. Emily reported that Richard held an emergency senior staff meeting the next day, a meeting from which Sophia was conspicuously absent. He spent an hour ranting about loyalty and vision, making thinly veiled threats against anyone who thought they could operate independently of his authority. Later, he and Sophia had a full-blown shouting match in his office, the sound muffled but the fury palpable through the thick glass walls. Their alliance, built on the shifting sands of mutual greed, was crumbling. They were now so consumed with watching each other that they were no longer watching me. My camouflage was working perfectly. Then came the call from Beatrice that changed everything. Her voice had lost its playful hunter's edge. It was now heavy, grim. Eleanor, this is bigger than embezzlement. The shell company your cousin-in-law is linked to. It's not just a repository for stolen funds. It's been acquiring a controlling interest in a private equity firm, a notoriously ruthless one called Argent Capital. She paused, letting the weight of it sink in. They specialize in hostile takeovers of charitable foundations, stripping them for their assets and liquidating the endowments. They don't just steal from the house, Eleanor. They burn it to the ground. A cold dread, colder than any fury I had felt before, settled in my bones. Suddenly, all the pieces snapped into a horrifyingly clear picture. The affair, the canceled chemo, the stolen money. They were all just means to an end. They weren't trying to just take control of the Vance Foundation. They were planning to execute it. They wanted to erase our name, our mission, our entire life's work, and walk away with billions. Delaying my treatment wasn't just about making me weak. It was about running out the clock, incapacitating me so I couldn't stand in the way of the final sale. My investigation had to pivot. This was no longer about exposing thieves. It was about stopping assassins from murdering my legacy. I looked out at the sprawling city from my window, the twinkling lights of Manhattan a testament to dreams built and realized. They had intended this penthouse to be my waiting room for death. Instead, it had become the headquarters for their undoing. The Silent War's intelligence-gathering phase was complete. I knew their crime. I knew their motive, and I had turned them against one another. They were wounded, paranoid, and fighting in the dark, still utterly clueless as to the true source of the chaos. Now, it was time to plan the main assault. It was time to prepare for the Beacon Gala, where I would stop being a ghost in the machine and become the executioner on the main stage. The call from Beatrice was not a declaration of victory. It was a warning siren. The name Argent Capital echoed in the sterile silence of my penthouse, a name synonymous with corporate raiding of the most predatory kind. They didn't invest. They consumed. They didn't restructure. They liquidated. My blood ran cold as I connected their business model to the puzzle pieces I had assembled. Richard and Sophia weren't just embezzling money to fund a lavish lifestyle. That was far too small, too pedestrian for their ambition. They were using my foundation's own money to buy the very weapon that would be used to execute it. They were paying for our own destruction with our own wealth, a betrayal so perfectly circular, so diabolically elegant, that it took my breath away. This was never about skimming from the top. It was about raising the entire empire to its foundations and selling the rubble for parts. My mind raced, searching for the mechanism, the legal loophole that would allow such a monstrous act. It had to exist within the foundation's own architecture, a weakness I had overlooked, a vulnerability Richard had known about and planned to exploit. With a shaking hand, I accessed the secure server where our founding documents were stored. I spent the next hour reading through the dense legalese of the bylaws, a document I had co-authored but hadn't studied in years. And then I found it. Article 9, Section 4B, a clause, inserted by Richard's lawyers during a revision a decade ago, which I had approved with a cursory glance, trusting him completely. It stipulated that in the event a founding member was declared medically or mentally incapacitated by their primary physician, full and unilateral control of the foundation would be transferred to the other founder to ensure continuity of leadership. It was a loaded gun, and it had been pointed at my head for 10 years. The words chemo brain floated into my mind, a term Richard had used with such feigned sympathy in recent weeks. "Don't worry, Eleanor. A little memory fog is normal," he'd say, patting my hand. "That's why I'm here to handle things." It wasn't a term of comfort. It was a diagnosis he was building, a narrative he was constructing brick by brick. He was going to use the very real side effects of my life-saving treatment as a pretext to have me declared incompetent. The canceled appointment, the delays. It all clicked into place with sickening precision. They weren't just trying to make me weak, they were trying to make me appear cognitively impaired, confused, and unfit to lead, all timed perfectly for an upcoming board meeting. They were going to steal my legacy by convincing the world I had lost my mind. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it was a physical force, pressing the air from my lungs. But one piece of the puzzle still felt horrifyingly out of place. To trigger that clause, Richard needed more than just his own word. He needed the official, signed declaration of my primary physician. He needed my oncologist, my trusted, celebrated, world-renowned oncologist, Dr. Alistair Finch. I had known Alistair for 15 years. He was a friend, a man whose research our foundation had funded, a man I had entrusted with my very life. The idea was preposterous, a betrayal so profound it bordered on the unthinkable. It had to be a mistake. Richard must have a different plan, another doctor he was going to bring in. Alistair would never agree to such a monstrous ethical breach. He was a healer, a man of science and integrity. My mind recoiled from the implication, desperately seeking any other explanation that would keep my faith in him intact. My denial shattered the next morning. It came in the form of a routine email from Dr. Finch's office, confirming my rescheduled chemotherapy appointment for the following day. Attached was my treatment protocol summary, something they sent before every session. Usually, I barely glanced at it, trusting the process implicitly. But this time, Beatrice's warnings and the discovery of Article 9 had made me paranoid. I opened the file, my eyes scanning the complex names of the cytotoxic drugs and their dosages. And there it was, a small but significant adjustment to the dosage of a secondary drug in my cocktail, one known for its potent neurological side effects. The clinical notes justified the change with a vague reference to optimizing the therapeutic window. My heart stopped. It was a lie. I knew enough about my own treatment to know this change was not standard. It was designed to maximize cognitive disruption. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the cancer. My sanctuary, my own body, had been turned into a weapon against me. Dr. Finch, the man whose calm voice had reassured me through my darkest fears, was not my healer. He was my poisoner. He was a co-conspirator, bought and paid for by Richard, subtly manipulating my treatment to induce the very symptoms they needed to have me declared incompetent. Every moment of fatigue, Every lapse in memory I had attributed to the disease was now cast in a sinister new light. Had it been the cancer, or had it been the cure? The line between them had been deliberately blurred. I was being medically gaslit, my reality systematically dismantled by the two men I trusted most in the world, my husband and my doctor. The fight for my foundation had just become a fight for my life. The clock was no longer just ticking, it was screaming. The annual Beacon Gala was in 10 days. The critical board meeting Richard had scheduled was the morning after. He had planned it perfectly. I would be at my weakest, my mind clouded by a fresh, potent dose of neurologically disrupting chemicals, just in time for him to present Dr. Finch's expert assessment of my incapacity. I had less than 2 weeks to not only gather irrefutable proof of their conspiracy, but to do it while my own mind was under active chemical assault. The sheer audacity of their plan was matched only by its imminent danger. My vulnerability was no longer a camouflage I could wear and discard at will. It was a very real and rapidly advancing state of being. They were closing in, and the walls of my penthouse suddenly felt less like a command center and more like the walls of a tomb. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. My cold fury returned, sharpened by the primal instinct for survival. My first move had to be to establish a baseline, to get an unbiased assessment of what was truly happening inside my body. I needed a second opinion, but I couldn't simply walk into another hospital. Richard monitored my every move, every appointment, under the guise of loving concern. I had to become a ghost. I called Emily, my voice a carefully constructed blend of weakness and frustration. "Emily, I'm having a terrible reaction to this new protocol," I whispered. "I feel so foggy. I need you to do something for me, and it must remain between us. Richard would worry himself sick, and I can't bear that." I was using his own twisted narrative against him, framing my secrecy as an act of love to protect his feelings. My request was simple and audacious. I needed her to book an appointment for me under her own name at a private diagnostic clinic in a different borough. The clinic was run by Dr. Isabella Rossi, a brilliant oncologist who had left the rigid world of hospital bureaucracy to focus on patient-centered care. She was a rival of Dr. Finch, known for her sharp mind and sharper skepticism of established protocols. I would go in as Emily's aunt, a woman concerned about her recent diagnosis. Emily was to pay in cash from a personal account I had already funded. We would go in the middle of the day, when Richard and Sophia believed I was in bed, resting after my latest infusion. It was a desperate gamble, a high-wire act with no safety net. If we were caught, their entire plan would accelerate, and my chances of survival would plummet to zero. The next few days were a masterclass in deception. I had to endure Dr. Finch's infusion, allowing his poison to enter my veins while making small talk about the weather. The metallic taste in my mouth was a constant reminder of his betrayal. The cognitive fog was real, a thick blanket that threatened to smother my thoughts. I had to fight through it, forcing myself to focus, to keep my strategic mind sharp even as the chemicals worked to dull it. I feigned increased weakness and confusion during my phone calls with Richard, playing the part of the deteriorating patient to perfection. "I'm sorry, darling. What were we just talking about?" I'd ask, letting a long pause hang in the air. My mind is just not what it used to be. Each feigned stumble was a small victory, lulling him into a false sense of security, making him believe his plan was proceeding flawlessly. But my performance was perhaps too good. Richard, smelling victory, grew bolder. He began to restrict my access to information, a clear sign that the endgame was approaching. My remote access to the Foundation's server was suddenly revoked, with a patronizing email from IT explaining it was a new security measure to protect senior executives from phishing attempts. When I asked Emily to bring me some hard copies of financial reports, Sophia intercepted the request, telling Emily that Mr. Vance had ordered that I was not to be burdened with work of any kind. They were systematically cutting my lines of communication, tightening the noose, and isolating me from the very data I needed to build my case. They were no longer just managing a sick woman. They were imprisoning a potential threat. The psychological pressure was immense. They were trying to make me feel helpless, to reinforce the narrative that I was no longer capable. One evening, Richard called, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Eleanor, I've been talking with Alistair," he said softly. "He's concerned about the stress you're under. He and I both think it might be best if I handle all communications with your friends and the board for a while. You need absolute rest. No distractions." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. He was trying to sever my connection to the outside world, to cut me off from any potential allies. He was building the walls of my prison higher, brick by brick, ensuring that by the time he made his move, no one would be able to hear me scream. The man who had vowed to protect me was now my jailer. My trip with Emily to Dr. Rossi's clinic felt like a scene from a spy thriller. I wore a simple dress, a headscarf, and large sunglasses, a disguise that made me feel both anonymous and horribly conspicuous. Every passing car on the street seemed to hold a threat. Every stranger's glance felt like a look of recognition. Emily was a rock, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of my own heart. In the waiting room, I felt a tremor of fear. What if Dr. Rossi didn't believe me? What if she thought I was a delusional patient, a victim of the very chemo brain I claimed was being weaponized against me? My entire plan, my very life, hinged on the judgment of this one woman whom I had never met. Dr. Rossi was a force of nature, sharp, direct, and with eyes that seemed to see right through my flimsy disguise. I laid out my story, my voice low and steady despite the tremor in my hands. I didn't present it as a conspiracy theory. I presented it as a medical puzzle. I showed her my original treatment protocol and the recent, altered one from Dr. Finch. I described my symptoms, focusing on the cognitive effects that seemed disproportionate to the standard expectations. I asked her for an independent blood panel and a medical review. I needed data. I needed a second, unimpeachable expert opinion. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. For a long, terrifying moment, she just stared at the files. Then, she looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Professional outrage. "The dosage of this secondary agent is aggressive," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Clinically, it's almost indefensible unless you had a very specific and rare set of contraindications, which you do not. It's maximized for neurotoxicity." She ordered the blood work immediately. "We'll have the results rushed. We'll know exactly what's in your system." Leaving her office, I felt a surge of validation that was quickly tempered by a chilling fear. I now had a potential ally, a powerful one, but I had also confirmed the terrifying truth. The poison was real, the conspiracy was real, and the men behind it were growing more desperate by the day. They had escalated from theft to a plot of corporate destruction. Now, they were engaged in active, malicious medical harm. There was no line they wouldn't cross. The atmosphere in the penthouse grew heavier, more oppressive. Richard's visits became less frequent, his calls more perfunctory. He was detaching, distancing himself from the woman he was preparing to betray. Sophia, on the other hand, became a more constant presence, her visits filled with a sickeningly sweet concern. She would bring me smoothies, packed with antioxidants, fluff my pillows, and read me glowing articles about the Foundation's recent successes, her successes. It was a performance of loyalty designed to mask her surveillance. She was there to monitor my decline, to report back to Richard on the efficacy of Dr. Finch's chemical warfare. I was a lab rat in my own home, and she was the lab technician, taking meticulous notes on my deterioration. Their arrogance was their greatest weakness, but it was also what made them so dangerous. They were so convinced of my fragility, so certain of their intellectual superiority, that they started to get sloppy. One afternoon, Sophia left her tablet on the coffee table when she went to take a call in the other room. It was a foolish mistake, a lapse in her usual meticulous caution. My heart hammered against my ribs. This could be it. I knew her passcode. She had used it in front of me dozens of times, confident I was too out of it to notice. With trembling fingers, I unlocked the screen. Her email was open. My eyes scanned the inbox, and my breath caught in my throat. The subject line of a recent message from Richard read, "Gala seating and Finch confirmation." I opened the email. It was a short, chilling exchange. Richard confirmed that Dr. Finch would be seated at their table at the gala, a public display of their close relationship, but it was the final line that made my blood freeze. Alistair confirmed he will have the final signed assessment ready for me by 9 a.m. post-gala, Richard had written. He says the latest infusion should ensure she is in a state of significant cognitive confusion for at least 48 hours, more than enough time for the board to see for themselves. It was the smoking gun, a written confession of their entire plot, detailing the timeline, the method, and the goal. They were going to parade me at the gala, let the world see my decline, and then have me legally erased the next morning. I quickly forwarded the email to a secure, anonymous account Beatrice had set up for me, then deleted the forwarded message from Sophia's sent folder. I covered my tracks in seconds, my mind moving with a clarity and speed that felt like a gift. The fog of the chemo receded, burned away by the sheer adrenaline of the moment. I placed the tablet back on the table, exactly where she had left it, just as she walked back into the room, smiling her false, predatory smile. She had no idea that her carelessness had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy them. The evidence was now secure, a digital bomb waiting to be detonated. The satisfaction was immense, but it was fleeting, replaced by the grim reality of what I still had to do. I now had proof of the financial crimes from Beatrice, proof of the medical conspiracy from Richard's own email, and I would soon have the independent medical data from Dr. Rossi. But I needed one final devastating piece of evidence. I needed to connect Richard directly to Dr. Finch in a way that no lawyer could ever dismiss. I needed their voices. I needed to record them discussing their plan to destroy me. It was the riskiest move of all, one that would require me to put myself directly in the line of fire. I had to orchestrate a situation that would force Richard to call his paid poisoner, and I had to do it without him ever suspecting that he was walking into my final, perfectly laid trap. The next day, Dr. Rossi called. Her voice was grim. "The blood panels are back, Eleanor. The levels of the secondary drug in your system are not just high. They are at a level that no responsible physician would ever administer for a patient in your condition. This isn't just malpractice, it's assault. I have a legal duty to report this." I begged her to wait, just for a few more days. "I am building a case, doctor," I explained, my voice low and urgent. "Reporting it now will alert them, and they will bury it, and me, in an avalanche of legal maneuvers. Let me finish this. Let me expose them in a way they can never escape." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You have until the day after the gala," she finally said. "Then I make my call, with or without your consent." The fuse was lit. My plan for the final piece of evidence was born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of my husband's vanities. I knew his greatest fear was not being in control. I decided to give him a reason to believe he was losing it. I called him, my voice frantic, a performance of pure, chemo-induced paranoia. "Richard, I don't feel right," I cried, letting my words slur slightly. "I'm seeing things. The room is spinning. I think something is wrong with the medicine. I feel like I'm losing my mind." I was presenting him with a crisis, a variable he hadn't accounted for. My reaction was more severe than they had anticipated. His carefully calibrated plan was threatening to go off the rails. He would have to consult with his co-conspirator. He would have to call Dr. Finch. "Just calm down, Eleanor," he said, his voice tight with annoyance rather than concern. "It's just the chemo. You're overreacting. Lie down. I'll handle it." I knew exactly what handling it meant. He would immediately call Alistair to ensure their plan wasn't about to backfire, to ask if this extreme reaction was normal, to confirm that I wouldn't have a complete breakdown before the board meeting. As soon as I hung up with him, I activated the recording software Beatrice had secretly installed on our home network's phone system. It was designed to capture and encrypt all outgoing calls from his study. I had laid the bait. Now, all I could do was wait and pray that his arrogance and panic would make him walk right into the snare. The minutes stretched into an eternity. I sat in the silence of my living room, my body humming with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. I was a hunter waiting for the prey to step on the pressure plate. Then, I heard it. The faint, muffled sound of his voice from his study down the hall. He was on the phone. My heart leaped into my throat. The recording software was capturing every word, every damning syllable. I could almost hear the pieces of his empire turning to dust. This was the moment of truth, the final nail being hammered into the coffin he had so carefully constructed for me. The war of shadows was over. The evidence was gathered. The stage was set for a public execution. A few hours later, a secure file appeared in my inbox from Beatrice. The subject line was a single word: checkmate. I opened it and listened to the recording. Richard's voice was sharp with anxiety. Alistair's was a smooth balm of false reassurance. "Is it possible we pushed the dose too high?" Richard asked. "She sounds completely paranoid." Alistair's reply was the sound of my victory. "Richard, this is exactly what we wanted," he said calmly. "The paranoia, the confusion. It's the perfect clinical presentation for the board. She's not having a medical crisis. She's having our desired outcome. Hold your nerve. We are less than a week away from the finish line." I listened to it twice, the cold, clinical words washing over me. They were discussing my manufactured insanity as if they were planning a corporate merger. With the recording saved and backed up across multiple encrypted drives, the final phase of my plan clicked into place. The Beacon Gala would not be the stage for my humiliation. It would be the theater for their annihilation. I had every piece of evidence I needed: the financial trail leading to Argent Capital, the incriminating email from Sophia's tablet, the independent medical analysis from Dr. Rossi, and now, the final, irrefutable audio recording of their conspiracy. They thought they were preparing to present a sick, confused woman to the world. They had no idea they were about to be the star witnesses at their own trial, with 500 of the city's most powerful people, and the press, sitting as the jury. I spent the next few days in a state of hyper-focused calm. I meticulously organized the evidence into a devastating narrative, working with Emily to embed the files into a video presentation. I wrote my speech, every word a precisely sharpened blade. I feigned continued decline to Richard and Sophia, allowing them to believe they had complete control. They saw a woman fading away, a ghost in her own home. They didn't see the general preparing for the final, decisive battle. They were so blinded by their greed and arrogance, so confident in their assessment of my weakness, that they were marching willingly towards the abyss. They had planned to murder my legacy, but in their hubris, they had handed me the shovel to dig their own graves. On the morning of the Beacon Gala, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back was paler, thinner, but her eyes held a fire that had been absent for years. The cancer had taken a physical toll, but the betrayal had forged my spirit into something unbreakable. I was no longer just Eleanor Vance, the gentle philanthropist. I was a survivor, a strategist, an avenger. Richard had once told me my only job was to get well. He was right. I had healed myself, not just from the cancer, but from the disease of his influence, his lies, and his condescension. Tonight, I would not be accepting an award on my behalf. I would be taking back my name, my foundation, and my life. The illusion of the perfect couple was about to be shattered in the most public way imaginable. Emily arrived with the gown I had chosen, a stunning, deep crimson dress that screamed power, not pity. "Are you ready, Mrs. Vance?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and nervous energy. I smiled, a real, genuine smile for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "I'm not Mrs. Vance tonight, Emily," I said, my voice clear and strong, with no trace of the weakness I had been performing for weeks. "Tonight, I am Eleanor." I was stepping out of the shadows and into the light, not as a victim of their plot, but as the architect of their downfall. They had wanted to erase my name, but after tonight, it would be the only one anyone remembered. The show was about to begin. My final act before leaving for the gala was to place a call. It wasn't to a lawyer or a board member. It was to the head of security at Cipriani Wall Street, a man whose child's life had been saved by a medical trial our foundation had funded years ago. I didn't tell him the details of what was about to happen. I simply said, "John, it's Eleanor Vance. I have reason to believe 2 of my foundation's executives may become a flight risk during tonight's event. I would consider it a personal favor if you ensured that all exits were discreetly but securely monitored. No one leaves the ballroom until my speech is over." His reply was immediate and unquestioning. "Consider it done, Eleanor. Anything for you?" The last piece was in place. The doors to the theater were locked. There would be no escape. I made my entrance to the gala not through the grand ballroom, but through a private service entrance, unseen by anyone. I was escorted to a secure suite overlooking the main hall, where a technical crew loyal to Emily was waiting. They had set up a live feed, ready to hijack the presentation screens at my command. I watched on a monitor as the guests arrived, a glittering sea of New York's elite. I saw Richard and Sophia working the room, accepting condolences for my illness with perfectly practiced solemnity. They looked like the king and queen of a kingdom they had already conquered, their victory so close they could taste it. The irony was a bitter but satisfying flavor on my tongue. They were celebrating on their own execution ground. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. The host for the evening walked to the podium and began to speak, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. He spoke of legacy, of philanthropy, of courage in the face of adversity. He spoke of me. On the monitor, I saw Richard's face, a mask of somber pride. He squeezed Sophia's hand, a gesture of shared triumph. They were completely oblivious, wrapped in the warm cocoon of their own deception. They believed they were the directors of this grand spectacle. They had no idea that they were merely the actors, and I, the ghost they thought they had vanquished, was about to give them their final cue from offstage. The host concluded his introduction. "And now, to accept this year's Beacon Award on behalf of the incomparable Eleanor Vance, please welcome to the stage the Foundation's CEO, her husband, Richard Vance, and director Sophia Clark." A wave of applause filled the room as they walked to the podium, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlights. They were radiant, powerful, the very picture of grace and leadership. They approached the microphone, ready to deliver their eulogy for a woman who was very much alive. I took a deep breath, my hand hovering over the button that would start the live feed. The silence in my suite was the calm before the storm. The moment I had been planning, fighting, and surviving for was finally here. Richard began to speak, his voice rich with emotion he did not feel. "My wife, Eleanor, wanted nothing more than to be here with you tonight," he began, his gaze sweeping across the rapt audience. "Her battle is a testament to her strength, a strength that has defined her entire life and this foundation." He paused for effect, letting the weight of his false sentiment settle over the room. On the massive screens behind him, a photo of me appeared, a soft, smiling image from years ago, the woman I used to be. It was the perfect visual for their narrative, the beatified, absent matriarch, but the woman in the picture was gone. In her place was a queen, ready to reclaim her throne. I leaned forward and pressed the button. The game was over. The image on the giant screens behind them flickered, died, and was replaced, not by the soft focus, sentimental video they were expecting, but by a high-definition, live feed, my feed. I wasn't in a hospital bed or a quiet room at home. I was seated in a leather chair, dressed not in silk pajamas, but in a crimson power suit, my gaze as sharp and unyielding as a surgeon's scalpel. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, a sound like the tide being pulled out before a tsunami. On the stage, Richard's face froze, his mouth half open, a statue of disbelief. Sophia's perfectly composed mask shattered, replaced by a flicker of pure, animal panic. I leaned slightly toward the camera, my voice amplified throughout the silent hall, each word a perfectly polished stone dropped into a still pond. "Thank you, Richard, for your kind words," I began. a hint of ice beneath the civility. But I believe our donors, our friends, and our partners deserve something you've never been willing to give them: total transparency. I gave a subtle nod to Emily, who was just off camera, and the first exhibit appeared on the screens, flanking my live image. For the past 2 years, I explained, my tone that of a lecturer delivering a fascinating but grim case study. Significant funds from the Genesis Initiative have been funneled into a shell corporation. Bank statements materialized on screen, with highlighted wire transfers, each one a digital breadcrumb leading to a company called Argent Capital. This wasn't simple embezzlement, I continued, watching Richard's face turn a pasty white on my monitor. It was a down payment. They were using our foundation's own money to purchase a controlling interest in a predatory equity firm, the very firm that was set to acquire and liquidate this foundation after I was removed. The word hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. The audience was no longer just watching an awards ceremony. They were witnesses to a corporate assassination plot. My next slide was an audio file. The waveform pulsed on the screen like a malevolent heartbeat before the sound filled the room. It was Richard and Sophia's voices, captured from his study, their words dripping with condescension. Richard's voice: "We just need to manage her for another few weeks. Keep her calm and confused." Followed by Sophia's cool, calculating reply: "Her emotional state is our biggest asset right now. The board needs to see a woman who is falling apart, not a leader." I let the audio play, a symphony of their treachery. The whispers in the ballroom grew to a shocked murmur. On stage, Sophia took a half step away from Richard, a tiny, instinctive movement of dissociation. The two architects of my downfall were beginning to see that the prison they had built for me was, in fact, a cage for them, and the walls were closing in. But stealing my foundation, my money, and my reputation wasn't enough, I said, my voice dropping, becoming more personal, more dangerous. Their plan required something far more intimate. It required the weaponization of my own body. The screen changed again, now showing a side-by-side comparison of my original chemotherapy protocol and the altered one prescribed by Dr. Alistair Finch. Then, a video began to play. My secret consultation with Dr. Rossi. Her face, stern and professional, filled the screen as she pointed to the data. "This dosage is not therapeutic," her recorded voice declared with cold fury. "It is designed to maximize neurotoxicity, inducing severe cognitive impairment. This is not a treatment plan. It is a chemical assault." A wave of outrage swept through the room. Dr. Finch, seated at their table near the stage, looked as though he'd been turned to stone. Then came the final, most damning piece of evidence. The ace of spades I had been holding for this very moment. "Some of you may think my husband was merely misled by a corrupt doctor," I stated, my eyes boring into the camera lens, speaking directly to every person in that room. "Allow me to clarify his involvement." I played the recording of the phone call, Richard's panicked voice asking, "Is it possible we pushed the dose too high? She sounds completely paranoid." And then, Dr. Finch's calm, chilling reply, echoing through the grand hall. "Richard, this is exactly what we wanted. The paranoia, the confusion. It's the perfect clinical presentation for the board. She's not having a medical crisis. She's having our desired outcome." A dead, suffocating silence fell upon the room. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It was a confession, a verdict, and a death sentence for their careers, their reputations, and their freedom. I let the silence hang for a long, agonizing moment, watching them on my monitor. They were trapped in the glare of 1,000 eyes, their guilt laid bare on the altar of their own ambition. Richard, his face contorted in a mask of pure terror, made the last mistake a drowning man can make. He tried to pull someone else under with him. He turned to Sophia, his voice a venomous hiss just barely caught by the podium microphone. "This was you and your ambition. You pushed me into this." It was the spark that ignited the gasoline. Sophia, her face a mask of fury, spun on him, her voice raw and filled with scorn. "Liar. This was about your pathetic ego." You couldn't stand living in her shadow, so you decided to burn everything down just to feel like the king of the ashes. Their ugly, incriminating argument became the main event. They tore into each other, a pair of scorpions in a bottle, revealing even more sordid details of their plotting in a desperate, pathetic attempt to assign blame. He accused her of planting the idea of the merger. She screamed that he was the one who found the doctor willing to poison his own wife. They were no longer the polished, powerful couple who had taken the stage moments before. They were just two greedy, desperate criminals, cannibalizing each other under the hot, unforgiving lights, their public implosion a far more compelling confession than any evidence I could have presented. They were destroying each other, live and in high definition, for the entire world to see. It was a pathetic, yet fitting, end. I gave my final nod to Emily. My feed cut out, replaced by the serene, smiling photograph of the woman I once was. The contrast was breathtaking. The ghost of the past looked down upon the wreckage of the present. I didn't need to say another word. On my monitor, I saw the security team I had arranged moving quietly and efficiently toward the stage. The flashes of press cameras began to strobe, a chaotic, silent lightning storm capturing the exact moment their world ended. I stood up from my chair, the adrenaline slowly giving way to a profound, quiet calm. The war was over. This wasn't just revenge, it was a resurrection. I had walked through the fire of their betrayal and emerged not scorched, but forged. The Eleanor Vance they had tried to erase was gone forever, and in her place stood the woman who had taken back everything. The chaos that erupted in the ballroom was not my concern. It was the messy, predictable death rattle of a failed regime. From the quiet sanctuary of my suite, I watched on the monitor as Richard and Sophia were escorted off the stage, their faces a grotesque collage of shock and incandescent rage. The popping flashes of the press cameras were like silent explosions, capturing their disgrace for eternity. My war had been fought in the shadows, with encrypted files and whispered phone calls. Theirs ended in a cacophony of public humiliation. They had wanted to make me a ghost, a footnote in my own story. Instead, I had made them the star attractions in a tragedy of their own making, and I didn't even have to be in the room to watch the final act. My victory wasn't loud, it was absolute. A quiet and complete checkmate delivered from an untouchable distance. The next morning, their faces were plastered across every news outlet, their names forever linked with scandal, greed, and a spectacular level of hubris. The Vance Foundation was at the epicenter of a media firestorm. The old Eleanor would have hidden, mortified by the public stain on our legacy. But the old Eleanor was gone. I scheduled a press conference for noon that very day. There would be no hiding, no comment from a team of lawyers. The foundation had been poisoned, and the only way to save the patient was for the surgeon to make the first incision, publicly and with unflinching precision. I would not be defined by their betrayal. I would be defined by my response to it. I was stepping not into a crisis, but into my rightful place at the helm, and the entire world was invited to watch. I stood before the bank of microphones not as a victim, but as a commander. I wore a simple, elegant navy dress, the color of stability and authority. My voice, when I spoke, was not the frail whisper they had tried to engineer, but a clear, resonant instrument of power. I did not ask for pity. I did not dwell on the personal pain, for that was my own affair. Instead, I laid out the facts with the dispassionate clarity of a final report. I acknowledged the profound breach of trust, framing it not as a failure of the foundation, but as a malignancy that had been identified, isolated, and now surgically removed. My calm was my armor, my transparency my weapon. I was demonstrating to our donors, our employees, and our beneficiaries that the institution was not built on the shifting sands of two people's egos, but on a mission that was far stronger than any individual. Effective immediately, I announced, my gaze sweeping across the room of stunned reporters. I am dissolving the current executive board and assuming direct control of all foundation operations. I outlined a complete restructuring, a top-to-bottom purge of Richard's loyalists and anyone who had been complicit through their silence. In their place, I announced a new leadership team, promoting from within. Emily, my loyal assistant, was named the new chief of staff, her stunned but proud face visible in the front row. I was not just cleaning house, I was rebuilding it on a new foundation of merit and unwavering integrity. I was sending a clear message. The era of shadows and secrets was over. The Eleanor Vance Foundation would operate in the full, unforgiving light of day, and I would be the one to ensure it. Their downfall was as swift as it was brutal. Stripped of their assets and facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, they had no defense. Richard, Sophia, and Dr. Finch were all denied bail, deemed flight risks. The legal proceedings were a mere formality. Richard and Alistair received lengthy prison sentences for conspiracy, fraud, and aggravated assault with a chemical agent. Sophia, in a desperate attempt at a deal, turned state's evidence, but her role was so central that she still received a significant sentence. Their names were disgraced, their fortunes seized to pay restitution to the foundation, their power turned to ash. They had tried to erase me, but in the end, the only thing they managed to erase was themselves. Their destruction was a footnote in the story of my rebirth. With the external war won, I turned to the internal one. Dr. Rossi became my primary physician, her sharp, no-nonsense approach a welcome antidote to Finch's cloying poison. Under her care, my treatment was no longer a weapon against me, but a tool for my healing. We fought the cancer with honesty, data, and a shared determination. The fog in my mind lifted, replaced by a clarity I hadn't felt in years, and a few months later, the call came. The scans were clear. The word remission felt less like a medical diagnosis and more like a declaration of independence. I had survived my husband, I had survived my doctor, and I had survived the disease they had tried to use as their accomplice. I had won on every front. My first act as a woman in full remission was a symbolic one. I signed the documents that legally and officially changed the name of our life's work. The Vance Foundation was a name built on a lie, a shared legacy that had been corrupted beyond repair. It died with Richard's conviction. In its place, the Eleanor Vance Foundation was born. It was a declaration that this mission, this empire of hope, was now singularly mine. It was no longer the product of a partnership, but the testament of a survivor. The name on the building was no longer a shared brand. It was my personal standard, a flag planted firmly on the ground I had reclaimed. The full weight of our fortune, once a shared asset, now settled entirely under my control. It was a staggering sum, a level of wealth that could feel more like a burden than a blessing. But I no longer saw it as just money. I saw it as power, raw and undiluted. The power to accelerate research, to fund the riskiest and most brilliant ideas, to save lives on a scale Richard's timid, ego-driven vision could never have comprehended. He had wanted to be king of the ashes. I found I was far more interested in being the architect of the future. I wielded my wealth not like a shield, but like a sculptor's chisel, ready to carve a new legacy from the marble of what remained. My inner circle was rebuilt from the ground up, forged in loyalty and competence. Emily was my right hand, her sharp instincts and unwavering dedication a constant source of strength. Beatrice, my old Vassar friend, accepted a permanent seat on my new, streamlined board of directors. Her forensic genius now a permanent asset protecting the foundation's integrity. I surrounded myself not with sycophants and flatterers, but with brilliant, honest people who challenged my ideas and shared my vision. I had lost a husband and a protégé, but I had gained a true family, one bound not by blood or vows, but by a shared purpose and a deep, earned respect. My penthouse, once a gilded cage, now hosted strategy sessions that were changing the face of medical philanthropy. ¿Te está gustando esta historia? Deja un like y suscríbete al canal. Ahora continuamos con el video. Months later, I stood alone in the newly renovated boardroom. The heavy, dark wood Richard had favored was gone, replaced with glass, steel, and light. The room felt like it could breathe again. It was late, and the city lights of Manhattan glittered below, a sprawling galaxy of human ambition. I was healthy, my body my own again. The foundation was thriving, more focused and impactful than ever before. Everything they had tried to take from me, my health, my legacy, my name, I now possessed in greater measure. I had taken their poison and metabolized it into power. The silence in the room was not empty. It was filled with the quiet hum of absolute control. I looked at my reflection in the vast window, the city superimposed over my own image. I didn't see the soft, trusting woman I had been, nor did I see the cold, calculating avenger who had plotted their demise. Both were necessary parts of the journey. But they were not the destination. The woman staring back was someone new, someone whole. She was a leader forged in the crucible of an unimaginable betrayal, a survivor who had discovered that her greatest strength was not the love she gave to others, but the fierce, unyielding belief she had finally found in herself. They had tried to bury me, but they had made a critical mistake. They had forgotten that I was a seed. I had not just reclaimed my life, I had redefined it. The fire was meant to be my funeral pyre, but it had instead become my forge. I emerged from the flames not as a victim seeking solace, but as a queen who had built her throne from the ashes of her enemies. The empire was mine, the future was unwritten, and for the first time in my life, I was completely, gloriously, and powerfully alone. And I knew, with a certainty that resonated in my very bones, that my real story was just beginning. This was not the end of a chapter. This was the first word on a brand new page,